Hello and welcome. Welcome to Alta Live. My name is Beth Spotswood. I'm the digital editor of Alta Journal, and I am so excited to welcome you all today to a very special episode. Before we get started, I'm just going to kind of run through the lay of the land for you all. Today, we are going to talk about the legendary rapper Tupac Shakur. 25 years after his murder, his legacy looms larger than ever as new fans connect his lyrics and legacy to Black Lives Matter, social inequality, and poverty. Alta Journal contributor Santi Elijah Holley, who wrote about the continued cultural impact of Shakur's work, as well as a museum exhibit on his artistry, for our current spring issue, sits down with hip hop historian and journalist Davey D to discuss the undeniable staying power of this late West Coast artist. Santi Elijah Holley is the author of Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds Murder Ballads and The Forthcoming An American Family, a biological history of the Shakur family. He's a previous Alta Journal contributor. We're going to send you links to all of his amazing work in Alta. Dave Cook, Davey D, is a nationally recognized journalist, adjunct professor at San Francisco State, a hip hop historian, political commentator, syndicated talk show host, radio programmer, and media justice and community activist. He also knew Tupac Shakur. Before we get started and I turn things over to Dave, if you're unfamiliar with us, Alta Journal is an award-winning quarterly based on California and the West. We host events like this every Wednesday at 12:30. We also host a California book club once a month. If you like what we do here today, if you like this kind of content, I do hope you will check out our website at altaonline.com. We offer a $3 a month digital subscription. We're having a sale right now, an Alta Live sale. You can score a year of Alta, a tote bag, a book, for $37.50. I'm going to send you links to all of this. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Please use that to ask your questions of Santi and Davey. They will chat for about 30 minutes, and then Davey will ask me back. We'll get to as many of your questions as we have time for. This conversation will be recorded and posted to altaonline.com later today. Again, we're going to shoot you an email with links to this interview, links to Davey D's work, Santi's work, the article, anything that pops up today. You don't need to take notes. We will do it on your behalf. I like to, before I get lost and turn things over to Dave, please let us know in the chat where you are zooming in from. I am just north of San Francisco in Novato, California. So please share down in the chat where you're coming from today. And with that, I am delighted to turn it over to Davey D and Santi Elijah Holley.
Well, thank you for that. I want to say what's up to everybody. And Santi, good to meet you. And good article, very relevant. And the obvious question would be, why did somebody who was young when Tupac, left us, be inspired 25 years later to do an article that looks at his legacy? Yeah, we'll start off with that. That's an obvious one, but we'll build from there.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, thanks for doing this, to Alta. Thanks, Dee, for doing this. The article, was a way for me to really answer that question of why we're talking about Tupac, today, why we're still debating him and listening to him, why he's still, in the conversation. And, for me, like, I got into Tupac, like, as you said, at a young age. And, all I knew was just he made good music. That's all, that's all everybody really knew at that moment was he made fire music. He seemed important. He seemed like he was larger than life. And so I was a fan from the beginning. Not until I got older, and still listened to his music, but wanted to learn more about who he was as a person. Because the more you listen to his music, the more you realize there's something deeper going on in those lyrics, in those songs. So I started just diving deeper into his history, his personal history, his life history, his biography, and just realized that he was this deeper dude than that I knew when I was listening to him. He was just his lyrics, his music was deeper than I think most people when they first get interested. So I wanted to sort of show that side, show that part of him and his biography and the more complicated parts of his story, because I think that's what made his music so rich. That's why people are still talking about him all these years later,
Right.
because his music was so rich, so deep, and is connected with you on such a deep level. So that's, so I was like, oh, who else recognized that? Who else knew that? And I just started going deeper and deeper into his story. And I was just like, man, I just need to, like, share these stories of people that also connected with them on a deeper level than that.
It's interesting to hear you see him from the standpoint when you first encountered him as a guy who made good music. So there's a generational thing, because I think people who are a little bit older knew him for the political aspect of him. So it's interesting to hear that you come from that standpoint. But with that being said, his political prowess, what stood out for you, and what did you want to convey in the article for people to really grab hold of, as you noted, many people discovered Tupac after his death and not before.
Yeah, and I, his connection, like you just mentioned, like his connection to sort of the more radical, sort of more political, like, actions and themes and sort of philosophies, all that. He came out of that tradition. He came out of that. His whole family came out of a very radical Black liberation tradition, and he was raised that way. For me, I wanted to show that because I think it gets lost a lot of times. Like, just when people talk about Tupac, that side of him gets lost. Like, you knew him, so you knew how politically, how sharp he was, and how, socially, what kind of, like, how attuned he was to the movement.
Yeah.
I didn't know that until much later. But then once you know that, once you know his background and the family that he came out of, and his parents, his everybody that raised him, like, once you know that, it all starts to make sense, like why he was so conflicted in his music, in his life, in his personality. And yeah, I mean, he's just a deeper dude than, I think a lot of people.
Yeah, I think the important part is that, Pac, that I remember, was sharp and well-read. I think that's often lost in the sauce. Like, he did read, he did have a firm grasp. He was a smart guy. And I think he was also very intentional about trying to appeal to those who are often left out. As he would say, if he went to the party, he wanted to go in the cuts and find the people that, in the back room, and really build with them. But, let's talk a little bit about his family. I know you talked to Mo Prima's brother, and we were talking offline about Mutulu Shakur, his stepdad, and others. The Shakur family has a rich history. The Black Panthers, BLA members. Mutulu is a political prisoner. There's a lot there. Do you feel that the legacy of the Shakurs, along with Tupac, is either something that is attempted to be distorted, redirected, or just omitted? I think oftentimes when we hear Tupac, we don't really talk about the legacy of the Shakur family, which I think is integral to really understanding him. And nowadays, there almost seems to be a revision, with people now trying to frame Tupac. Was he a good rapper? Was he not a good rapper? When that was never, ever a discussion in the 90s when he came out, but it is now. But from your standpoint, how have you seen the legacy and the challenge to keep it intact?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because I've been working on this book, which we can talk about later. But I've been working for the last couple of years on a book about the Shakur family, about the radical history of the Shakur family and the roots, and the first folks to call themselves Shakur, and the Black Panthers and BLA, the Black Liberation Army, and Republic of New Africa, which Mutulu Shakur is a part of. The Shakur family, yeah, is real deep. I mean, going back to the 60s, and a lot of people know about Afeni, his mother, Tupac's mother, being a Black Panther member in the Harlem chapter of New York, without realizing that his whole family was involved, not just in the Panthers, but in various, radical groups working towards Black liberation. And yeah, so the book that I'm working on, I've had an opportunity to speak with Mopreme, with Tupac's brother, with many different family members who are still alive, former political prisoners like Sekou Odinga, who were such an important part of the family and an important part of Tupac's upbringing, and his just in education, his political education. He was, and Tupac talked about this. Tupac talked about how he was raised to be the Black Prince of the Revolution. His mother Fanny always talked about he was going to be the Black Prince of the Revolution. He was going to carry on the movement. He was going to, just pick it up for the new generation. And then, so we had that in him. We had that pressure inside of him always. That was he doing the right thing by going into entertainment, by becoming a rapper? But Layla Steinberg, his first manager, told me like he thought originally he could carry on that work through music. That was his way. That was his vehicle of continuing his folks' work. In the movement was through his music. But then he got caught up in the system. He got caught up in the industry.
Right. So what do you think we should know about the radical outlooks, political outlooks of the Shakur family and Tupac himself that is often, not discussed?
I mean, they came out of the philosophy of the more militant, the more grassroots part of Black liberation. I mean, they weren't marching, holding hands, singing "We Shall Overcome." They were out there doing the work. Sometimes that work was not exactly legal work. It wasn't lawful, but they were doing the work. They came out of the Black Panthers, so they were very much like, on the ground. The brothers on the block. Just reaching out to the people who were disenfranchised. But then, because of that, because the oppression, the repression at the federal government, the FBI, the COINTELPRO program, all of that, they came down hard. And the Shakurs were always leaders in everything they did. From Black Panthers to the RNA, to the BLA, they were always leaders. And so, as the authorities do, they came after him hard. And Tupac and his sister Sechua, were raised with federal agents, coming around their school, coming around their home, because they were always on the run. They were always, people were looking, like they had people in their family who were fugitives from the law. So they'd come around and try to figure out where they were. Like Tupac and his sister grew up, with that reality of being, the government is after our family and we are. And so Tupac would say this soon. Like there's interviews where he'd say, because I'm a Shakur, I'm already a target. People already know who I am. People are already coming after me. Like the Shakur name was heavy. And that's what even Mopreme was like. Just once you take that name Shakur, once you are given that name Shakur, you already are like on the radar of the authorities, because it's been, years and years as the government's been tracking, and we still got Shakurs in prison. We still got Matu Shakur. So that's how long this
Right.
This battle has been going on between the Shakurs and the federal government. I mean, we still got Shakurs locked up.
When you talk about Tupac, Santi, there are three different Tupacs that we know. There's Tupac, who was a dancer for Digital Underground and associated with their legacy. There's the Tupac that went back to New York and pre-death row, trying to, the Tupac that was on the scene before Biggie, and in many ways, befriending Biggie and helping him come up, not the other way around. And then there's the Tupac that we know on death row. How have you looked at, the different ways in which people see him? And the fourth one is how we've all projected Tupac in the afterlife. So everybody has these interpretations of what Tupac would be doing in 2022, what sort of individual he would be in. And they project a lot, based upon how they perceived him in the past. How have you navigated, and what really sticks with you?
Tupac was more than three people. I mean, Tupac was many different people. I mean, Tupac embodied just multitudes, he was, he was a Gemini, so he was just constantly at war with himself. And like the death row Tupac, which I think is where most people start from. I mean, most people who aren't real, like,
And Death Row Records, for people who don't know.
Death Row Records was
yeah.
the last record label he was on, which was controversial. He does with his controversial henchman as a CEO. But I mean, Tupac was on death row the last part of his life. It was only 9 months that he was on death row. It was after he came out of prison. He was bailed out. He had a shady contract, and he was beholden to Suge Knight and death row for getting him out of prison. And he needed his career back and everything. But that part of time, that death row part of time, such a short part of his longer legacy and his longer life. And I think that's why I want to do this article, and also why it's good, like this particular exhibit down here in LA shows his childhood, his parents, his journal entries, him sort of evolving as a person, trying to find his own voice. I mean, like when he linked up with Digital Underground, like you said, he was just homeless, couch surfing, broke, living in Marin City, like crashing around Oakland, around the Bay Area. He just needed work, so he linked up with them to get his foot in the door. And then from there, he got a solo album, and got movie deals. So he had so many things. He was an actor, he was a movie star, he was a dancer. He was, at the same time, he was like, how can I bring it back to the message, to who I am as a person? He strayed further from, I think, what he thought that he could do inside the industry. Like his first album, Tupacalypse Now, is mostly, it's political. There's songs about police brutality, poverty, incarceration, back to back. It's just like, and then as the albums go on, and he gets further enveloped in this sort of insidious industry, he starts to lose the message. But as Layla Steinberg, which is his mentor, early manager, that she believed that he was always going to come back. He had to fulfill his contractual obligations to Suge Knight and Death Row. After that, though, he was going to come back. He was already working on it. He was already getting some things going, and then he got popped. So we never really got to see what he was going to do. But he got popped during the Death Row days. So that's kind of that has been sort of preserved as his legacy, unfortunately. But when it was so much more than that.
When you say that he lost his message, do you feel that he lost his message? I think it got stronger as he went on. What I remember is him and Snoop and Hammer speaking at the Brotherhood Crusade, talking about starting their own political party. I mean, it's incredible. We have an interview with him talking about things that they feel they could do politically. If I remember correctly, it was like, let's get Hammer to, because Hammer, even though it's from the hood, had that image of he could get you into schools, and Snoop had the street cred, and Pac had the politics, and they wanted to, start going into the schools and start to really get people politically motivated and eventually have our own political party. This is months before he's dying, before he's killed. He seemed very committed to executing the politics that we may have seen on the first album into real life, and maybe the records might, you could look at the records and say, well, not every song is political, but his day-to-day actions, there seemed to be a desire to really push the envelope. Did you find that?
Yeah, he had that desire. Things, his life really changed after he was ambushed in the Quad studio in New York, and he was shot multiple times and robbed. And then he became very bitter and hostile and paranoid, and he had a large chip on his shoulder, even if it was of his own making. Like even if he the debates, it's still the debate, who was involved, but he didn't trust anybody. He was on a warpath. I feel like his politics and his political work got shelved. I think he wanted to come back to it, but he was so angry and confused and hurt, and betrayed and abandoned, that I feel like that took the forefront of everything that he was doing. But then he listened to Machiavelli, which was the last, the posthumous album that came out after he died. And even there's still some of that. There's still some of the sort of very embittered songs, the very angry songs. There are more. You can see him writing some songs like White Man's World, where he actually does talk about, the things that he was talking about in the first two records. So yeah, I mean, he was going to go back there, but I did think
I lost you for a minute. Can you repeat that? I lost you for a minute.
Oh yeah, sorry. He did get distracted for a minute. Because he was so confused and betrayed and hurt. But I do think you can sort of see in Machiavelli that he's starting to, he wants to redeem himself a little bit. He says, I want to, do right. I've done wrong. I want to bring it back to, the roots. He shouts out Matu. He shouts out Asada. He's coming back. He's coming back to where he started. But I do think that he really did get, temporarily sidelined by.
Do we want to say that he was distracted and temporarily sidelined? And I ask this because, remember, he's 24 years old, and you're in an industry that has all the glitz and glamour. So there should be room for people to just have youth. And he was in jail. So, you're just getting out of that. That I think sometimes we forget that can be a traumatic experience as well, especially since, to the day that he passed, he felt like, he didn't do anything that got him in there, that it wasn't him directly involved with any sort of violation. So with that being said, have we allowed Tupac room to have just been a young 23, 24-year-old guy, in the middle of a crack epidemic, remember that, who, had a little fame and fortune and maybe wants to see what that's like, the same way that we would see anybody else who's that age who is coming into that sort of spotlight.
No, that's a perfect way of putting it. I mean, that's really what it is. He was a young man. I think because we now made such a hero, a legend, an icon out of him. We want our heroes, to be, especially, our late heroes, passed on. We want them to be just one thing. We want them to be fit into one box. This is who they were. This is what they represented. This is who they were their whole life, without, some dips and some, going around, but like finding your way, finding your voice. He was going through that in real time. He was working out, and we watched it happen, not just his music, but his interviews, everything. He was wilding out. We watched him be, a young man who was.
But a young man, I think a young man is no different than anybody else in the industry. Right. That's what I'm trying to contextualize that. I mean, I think I'm always curious as to, and not to say that the industry is right, but I mean, if we see that there's a pattern of people like, man, I'm on these stages, let me just kind of enjoy the comforts that it offers, then, is somebody like Tupac allowed to do that, even if he does have that political upbringing, considering all the, poverty, jail, family, all the run, it's like, man, I get to enjoy this limelight. Why not? And I only ask that because even in the middle of that, I never heard him do an interview where he didn't have the political acumen being reflected. You feel what I'm saying? I mean, almost every interview he did, he could speak to the issues very, very pointedly, with a political analysis. And I don't think he ever lost that. Whether or not it was going to be reflected on a song is a different thing, but I don't think he ever lost that. You tell me how you seen it.
No, I agree. Like, he never, I mean, like I said, he always carried that within him. He always was that person. I think that was his true self. And yeah, he wanted to have fun. He liked the money. He liked the attention. He liked the women. He liked he like, you know, all he liked, I mean, he was an actor, you know, for his whole childhood. And so now like he gets to be in movies on big screen, you know, he gets to do all, but he didn't have anybody really looking out for, or maybe he had a few people looking out for his best interests, but a lot of people who were like folks like Watani Taihemba, which was former security manager and family friend. Some people were looking out for him. A lot of people were just trying to take advantage of him, and he liked, I think he did like the attention. He was a shy kid growing up, so he liked being at the center of attention. Unfortunately, I think when he wanted to unite things by sort of play acting and being a gang member, you know, and that's when he was like hanging out and riding with actual gangbangers, and you know, that's when he starts to like kind of realize that he's a little in, like deeper than maybe he wanted to be.
Yeah, I also think he thought he could also maybe politicize them in some way, but that's
Yeah,
a very hard thing to do when you're not really in that life like that.
But that goes back to the Panthers, you know. I
Yeah.
mean, Panthers reached out to gang members. Panthers tried to unite gang members, you know.
But many of them came out of gangs themselves.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
there's a difference, you know, they was a part of that life. And so there's a different energy you bring to the table.
But sometimes what happens is then those gangbangers bring the gangs into the organization, and they have that mentality of like us versus them. I mean, even the Panthers had like a fatal feud between East Coast and West Coast, between the Huey Newton like camp in Oakland, and then Elvis Presley's camp out in New York. I mean, that
was along political lines and not, you know, some territorial beef.
Okay.
You know what I mean? That was so there's a political context, and I think, you know, that's a whole other discussion. But let me ask you this, Santi, with, you know, the article I think is great. I don't know how much I don't recall how much he reflected on his acting, because that thing I think is often overlooked too. He was he was an incredible actor. And I just want to get your thoughts, because in 2022, the acting aspect, man, that can open doors and really give you a stage, you know, if not just as large, maybe larger than the music industry itself. And I wonder what you think he would be doing if he was around in 2022 with that acting prowess under his belt, along with the music.
I wonder if he really would have even continued with music, or just focused on acting and just sort of become, you know, in his later years. I mean, obviously, like, I'm not in the business of talking about what people would do if they had survived, but he loved acting. I mean, he loved rapping too, but he really loved acting, and he was so good at it. I mean, yeah, this article doesn't really get into it because I had to sort of, you know, I have to kind of keep the focus on one thing. I could, you know, write for days about it.
You should have wrote another 3,000 words.
Well, I'm writing a whole book. So you have
okay. Okay, well, there you go. But no, let's come back to that acting, because I think that is an aspect that's overlooked, and it's celebrated by so many now. You know, your Will Smith and your Queen Latifahs and, you know, LL Cool J's. They all have these acting chops. Mos Def or Yasin Bey, great actors. And I think sometimes we forget that Pac might have been better than a lot of them when you really think about it. You know, I mean, and I just wonder where he would have been if he was able to continue, and especially just knowing he was also a prolific writer, if he would have been writing his own stuff. And you know what I mean? The potential in that direction is just so unbelievable when you think about it.
Yeah, from my understanding, without, you know, having known him personally, just from everything else that everyone else has already said about when he started acting, in big features, when he started with Juice, he was Bishop in Juice. It sounds like, from what everybody else has said about it that knew him at that time, that he really almost became Bishop. Like, that's when he thought that he was Bishop. But he even offset, he would just walk around like he wasn't that, you know, he wasn't this sociopathic, you know, dude, but he embodied that character so much that he almost did. And then the same with Above the Rim. He portrayed Birdie, which is, you know, the shot caller in New York. And, you know, he ran with other shot callers, Haitian Jack, and started to kind of like emulate them a little bit. So he really became, he was such a good actor, but he almost, his roles affected his life, which I think you shouldn't do as an actor, is let your roles who you portray actually seep into who you are as a person.
Right.
I think as he was starting, you know, he was doing that. I mean, he's a brilliant actor, like you said. I mean, he's so
But it
good.
makes you wonder if he then took on a role like a Marcus Garvey,
Hmm.
or if he became a Huey Newton, you know, in a role, then would he take on that persona, you know, because he was, you know, he was into it, you know, and I think a lot of actors from I see carry over some of the remnants of their parts that they play.
Yeah.
But yeah, to me, it's you know, that's an aspect I think we often forget about because we talk about Tupac the musician and forget dude was a great actor. I'm getting a signal, so we're going to bring Beth back. And Santi, I want to encourage everybody to read the article because you do dig in deep. And as you said, you talked to the family members and Mo Preem, his brother, and all those folks. So you did him righteously as we look back on 25 years. But Beth, you're back on the floor. So I know you've been looking at questions. So we're ready to go at it.
Well, a credit to you, Dave. You've touched on some of the questions that we got during the interview already.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
One, yeah, you hit those acting questions right away.
Okay.
Any other huge Poetic Justice fans? I loved Lucky in Poetic Justice. Everyone wants to know, what are each of your favorite Tupac songs
Oof.
and why? I know it's a tough one. It's a real tough one.
Not for me. You know, my favorite Tupac song, Streets of Death Row, off that first album. I think if you listen to the lyrics of that, he captures everything that he was about. You know, the struggles that he had, the conflict that he was going through, who he wanted to reach, and the Pac that I knew said he always wanted to be relatable to the people that didn't have a voice. And I think that song, from start to finish, captures it. You know, it's just one I listen to it and I'm like, yeah, you know, it's an affirming song for a lot of people. So ain't a hard choice for me. Streets of Death Row is my song.
What about you, Santi?
Yeah, I was anticipating that question and I was trying to think about it beforehand. And I couldn't, you know, the problem is there's so many different, as we were saying, there's so many different Pacs that sometimes it depends on what mood I'm in, you know, it depends on what I'm feeling at the moment. Like sometimes I'm really feeling positive, I want to do the work, I listen to changes, you know, or like, you know, just like something from the early records, but then sometimes, you know, I'm just feeling like I just want to cruise like through town and, you know, put the window down and listen to Live and Die in LA. Sometimes I feel angry and I want to listen to Hit 'Em Up. Sometimes, you know, I'd say my favorite record of his, from front to back, is Me Against the World. I think he was at his most mature, his most focused on that whole record. The song is one of my favorites. So I think I could put that record on and, you know, there's no skips for me.
No skips. Dave, you knew Tupac pretty well. Can you tell us if his persona and, you know, was different in real life, in person, one-on-one, than what the rest of us saw on the global stage?
I wouldn't say I knew him pretty well like that. You know, I mean, like his brother knew him well, and
Right, okay.
Shock and those
You
guys
knew
knew him
him.
well. But I knew him, and definitely would run into him, and et cetera, et cetera. And he's been over at the crib and all that. The first time I met Pac, Shock G brought him over. Me and Shock were cool. He sat right here on these staircases that I'm looking at, and I had a piano where I'm sitting at now. That was here. And I remember Shock was playing piano and Pac was sitting on the staircase and it was like, what's your name? And it was like Tupac. And it's like, what? You know, so, you know, we went through the whole thing with the name. He was shy, didn't say anything, you know, was soft-spoken, et cetera, et cetera. You know, over time, as I got to see him, you know, he became more talkative. And I think the most animated where there was a big contrast was maybe 2 days after he got beaten by the police right over here off of, I guess it was around Lakeshore, I mean, Grand Avenue, when, you know, around the lake where we're at, when he was beaten, and he came into a club called the Omni NWA was there, and he was all cut up, and he was like, man, these police did that, and he was on one, like, like, this is what we're going to do, this is what's going to happen. He explained what was going down, and you saw that fire. And then, I remember interviewing him. His brother Mopreme lived next door to me, and Tupac had an apartment up the street, so he was on Harrison, which is maybe about 3 blocks away. And so when I went to interview him there, Juice hadn't come out, but he had gotten part, and we were talking about that. And what hit me, he had a 38, sitting on the on the dresser, and it's like, why you have this 38? And he's like, I gotta make sure I protect myself. But that interview that we did was very profound. He talked about a lot of things that would come to pass. He talked about regional conflict because of the way the industry was, not recognizing people with different voices coming from other parts of the country. He talked about, taking his money and setting up school programs in a youth center from the lawsuit with the police. So there was a lot of things that he was saying. He was very committed and very focused on politicizing people. So that interview was, at the time, it was like, okay, I hear what you're saying. And it was in sync with, I think, everybody that we was around, because Digital Underground was always kind of political themselves. Money B, his father's a Panther. So that sort of conversation wasn't going to be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're saying it. It just seemed very right, right alongside where they would be at. But years later, after his death, when you listen to that interview, you realized that was a gem, that was, as they literally said, a rose that grew out of concrete. And, the sadness of not seeing somebody who had that something, that charisma and that natural political unforced, understanding, left before he could really get it going. Heaven knows, only, you can only imagine if he was around today, how outspoken he would have been, what sort of influence he would have had. And he was definitely committed and had the connections, and I think people that would have pushed him to really bring to light some of the things that he was talking about, like that whole thing when he was talking about, look, man, we're going to go in these schools and start politicizing these kids and start our own party. That's profound. Let's think about that. When he was talking about using their collective fan base to disrupt elections, that's profound. That's something that should have been nurtured. That something's like, well, you know what? Why not? He was about giving voice to the voiceless, and it's just a shame that the forces that were around were going to be too much to be overcome.
It's interesting, Santi, you talk a lot about, you were young when Tupac's music was becoming wildly successful and very young when he was killed. Clearly he was one of your influences and an inspiration to you. Who were some of Tupac's influences when he was younger?
I don't know. I don't want to be the one to speak for his music, but I know that he listened to a lot of soul music. I mean, I know his parents played a lot of like the old 70s soul music, and because that was their music, and he loved it too. He loved, I know in particular, he loved this one song called Black Seeds Keep On Growing by The Main Ingredient. But he also loved, when he got into hip hop when he was probably the age I was when I got into him, like 15, 16, like 17, like that's when, and that was like New York, early, hip hop, and it was just like boom boxes on the corner, and he wanted to be a part of that. He was a kid. He wasn't just like this little revolutionary, just listening to revolutionary music. Like he listened to hip hop, he listened to the music of his day, like that guy was listening to music in my day. So what was hot, for when he was a kid was, like Run DMC, Houdini, and then he was really I think when he was starting, I think, I mean, this is my impression, is that when he was starting his own rap career, or at least when he was starting to get, a little bit of attention, when he signed with Interscope, I mean, his influences were like what Ice Cube was doing. He really was really moved by Ice Cube, Public Enemy. Like that was like street but political, sensibility. So he was listening to all the Ice-T,
Right.
all
Two
these
rappers who have
rappers.
become actors, by the way.
But I think we also have to uplift Layla Steinberg and the poetry that he was writing, and the after school programs that they wanted to do, and Ray Love, who was also political, big shout out to him, and Strictly Dope. So I think at that time there was, at that era, we're talking about the golden age of hip hop. Pac comes out in the 80s. Most people think of him in the 90s, but he's coming out in the late 80s, and that's at the middle of the golden era of hip hop. So there's a lot of political conversation in the middle of all the chaos. And Digital Underground was also a political group, even though they did the Humpty Dance and all that, but there was Shock and all those guys had political understanding. And I think that was something that was allowed to flourish and be nurtured and uplifted and given a space. And I'm sure if Layla was here, talking, when he was writing his poems and doing all that, I think that was also an avenue to really voice some things. Yeah.
It wasn't just music, it was books. I mean, he was reading
Yeah.
so many books and so many
Yeah.
novels and histories and poetry that influenced him.
Yeah.
Just as much as the music he was listening to. And yeah, like you said, Layla Steinberg, who like mentored him, sort of gave him some books to read, but he was already reading. Like she was surprised when she met him how well read he already was as a 17-year-old. But she just helped him sort of develop that voice into something. And linked him up with Ray Love. I mean, he already knew Ray Love. Like you said, Ray Love was they were collaborating in Strictly Dope. So like, he had lots of different things going on in different places.
I'll tell you the funniest thing about Pac, and I had forgotten about it when I found an old interview that we did, and I didn't label it, and I flipped it on. I just had a tape, and I looked, and I said, "Oh wow, this interview we did." In the middle of the interview, Pac and Money B had this thing that they would do with each other, where they would talk about each other's moms in public spaces. So in the middle of a very serious conversation where Pac is like, I want to raise these youth and I want to help them come to get a voice of their own. And then I remember he goes, and then what we're going to do is we're going to take them to the Scared Straight program, and we're going to have Money B's mom, talk to them and then make beats, and it'd be like, what? And so what they would do is that whenever they got an interview, you would hear Money B next, be on the radio, and he'd be like, I want to give a shout out to Tupac's mom for, helping us lift weights. And they would just cap on each other's moms in these public interviews. And I thought that was just the funniest thing, that, that in the middle of whatever it was, if they was at a concert, whoever got the mic first would just shout out the other's moms. But there was that brotherhood and that friendship, and also a funny part, that went on to, I don't know for how long, but, just to hear in the middle of this thing, he said it so matter of factly, didn't break a smile, just was like, we're going to go get the Scared Straight, and, and his mom's going to make beats. And it's like, wait a second, what? And then you realize like, oh, okay, you all are still capping on each other in public spaces. So that was always a funny thing with them.
I love that. We're so out of time, but I want to ask two more questions before we wrap up. The first is one for both of you. Is there an artist today, either up and coming or established, who's got what Tupac had?
D, you want to take this one? I'm going to think about this.
Well, I think a lot of people would have said Nipsey Hussle. I think Nipsey was on his way to kind of connecting those dots in a way that we would have ideally liked Tupac to do. But I think there are a lot of artists that are like Tupac without the visibility and platform. And when I say artists, there's no singular artist, because I think what I see now are artist collectives. And I think Pac upbringing and knowing that you had to be in community, and I think he was attempting to do that when he had the Outlaws and his other people there. It's like, it's not just one person, it's a collective. So I would look at groups like Rebel Diaz, for example, and that artist collective. I think Dead Prez and that whole camp was, would have been, alongside that legacy. You have Grand National out here in the Bay, that large artist collective that I think are politically sharp, have street acumen, street connections, but are also knowing that they got to move as a unit. And I think the industry and also folks that clearly understand that if you let an artist loose and they start to really impact, their fan base in a political thing, that they can become threatening. I think there's an attempt to not allow those type of people with that potential to really shine in a way that they need to, if that's making sense. I think, so will we hear a Tupac type of artist on the radio again? Probably not. But do we need to listen to them on the radio? I think you find them in the trenches. I also think there are quite a bit of political women out there. Big shout out to people like Sa Rock out of Atlanta, and Mumu Fresh out of DC. And I think you're going to find that there are a number of artists in those underground enclaves that are doing the work, that are politically savvy and understand that maybe you don't need to be in the spotlight as much, that you can just do the work and have that radical revolutionary mindset, and touch people quietly. And last thing I'll say, to the degree that you can do more sometimes by helping empower those who have political aspirations. I think a lot of artists have been like, what, I don't need to be the spokesperson, but I can take this money that I made and I can make sure that you all are well resourced. And I think a lot of artists have been doing that over the years very quietly. And it's like, I'm gonna sing these songs over here. You don't need me to speak, but do what you do. And I think there's a lot of beneficiaries of that. And a lot of that comes from learning the lessons and trying to avoid the pitfalls that upended a lot of artists, in the past. That's how I see it, over the years.
Santi, the last question's for you. Can you tell us about your can you tell us about your Tupac book?
Yeah, so that's a good last question to end on. It's about the Shakur family, about Tupac's forebears, his people, more than it is about him. It's about his family going back to the mid '60s. Just the times of the Shakur family. It's not so much a biography of each individual Shakur, because I'm not trying to cover just a sort of life history. It is the times of the Panthers and other sort of more radical underground liberation groups that the Shakur family were a part of, and the various ways that the government has tried to eradicate those, but have always been led by Shakur. So the book, which I've been working on for the last couple of years, it's scheduled to be released sometime next year. We'll see how these things go, but I was fortunate to be able to speak and connect with a lot of different family members, people who were associated with them, people who rode with them, people who worked with them, people who did hard time for their work in the struggle. So it's a history of the Shakur family leading to Tupac, like why Tupac was so educated and so politically aware is because he came from a long tradition of people, strong, just leaders, Afeni Shakur, Mutulu Shakur, Assata Shakur, all these, there's so many others who were involved with the family and who committed their lives and sacrificed so much, for the cause of Black liberation in the US. which is what led to Tupac, which is what he grew up with, all of that around it. He grew up in the movement. He grew up in that movement. And so yeah, the book sort of charts that history of all these different organizations that people came with. And yeah, I mean, so it's like, it's not a Tupac book, but Tupac is very much, his presence is there. And the book leads to Tupac. You can see, he grows up as, the authorities are pursuing his family. And so you get to see all of that. And so, yeah, it's been a journey, but I'm really excited about it. I think it's a really good story. That's part of, it's part of American history that, we don't really know about. We know about the Panthers, we know about the civil rights movement, but not all the sort of more grassroots, on the ground, and and everything that they did and sacrificed for, in the name of this long, unending struggle. So.
I want to say one thing about what you're talking about, just to kind of give people a timeline. If we follow the understanding of hip hop history, which will be celebrating its 50th anniversary, next year. Remember that the Panther 21, which Afeni was a part of, happens just, there's an absence of those Panthers because they're caught up in the largest court case in the history of New York at the time. And the type of influence and guidance that I think they could have ideally dispensed on people, might not have been able to reach its full potential because they're dealing with these court cases. And it's in that sort of chaos that is also accentuated by extreme poverty and all that hip hop is born, because it's coming out in 73. And then from 72 on, you have a rewriting of history in Hollywood. So, the Panther characters are often being lampooned in blaxploitation movies. They're made to be caricatures. And you also have, these relentless attacks on the BLA and other offshoots of the Panthers, so that I don't think you really got a chance to have that correct baton handoff to early hip hop and the political aspects of the Panthers that, were really shining and really doing a whole lot of impactful work, especially in New York. I'd be curious just to see, how that impacted, because that Panther 21 trial, which, of course, they were all let off, but how much resources, and how much time and, what toll did it take on folks at, just when so much was in disarray, for this young audience, this young group of people that, who are teens, they're coming up and they're like having to find a way out of no way. And the proverbial older brothers and uncles and aunts that would have had that radical tradition were sidelined for a bit.
Yeah, I mean, the Panther 21 trial was pivotal. I mean, that's what I opened the book with, and that changed everything. But we talk forever about that. But
yeah. Well, when the book comes out, please come back and talk to us about it. We'll have Davey D review it. Come back. This has been such an exciting. What an incredible conversation. I'm so grateful. In fact, the comment right here is, once again, Alta has opened me up to a part of the American experience that had not been in my awareness. Thank you guys so much for being here. Before everyone leaves, I'd like to invite you to next week. We're excited to welcome Jane McGonigal to talk about her new book, Unimaginable. Following the following weekend, we'll welcome photographer Gordon Wiltsey, who's going to tell us all about his assignment of photographing wild boars for Alta Journal. So with immense gratitude to Santi Elijah Holley, we're so thrilled to have you in the magazine. And Davey D, you are an amazing moderator and a fascinating voice. I'm so grateful to you both for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
And with that, everyone, thanks for joining. We'll see you next week. Take care.
Thanks.
Big shout out. Peace.